Hello, everybody. I'm ex-Leo anti-theist, and today we're going to be covering something that I can't believe took me until I was 41 years old to realize inside the Bible. It's so blatantly obvious once you see it that it's almost impossible not to unsee it unless you are so indoctrinated that you can't use your common sense and reasonable rationality in order to go ahead and see what the words on the page actually clearly state. So first of all, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about myself. Very quick overall summary. Military veteran, 13 years in law enforcement. I was a devout Baptist growing up. I grew up to be, in the church. And then eventually I went on to be an usher and then a deacon inside the Baptist church. My studying led me down the path of becoming a Messianic eventually, where from there, I actually had my own home fellowship. I had a YouTube channel for a while. And then from there, continued to study. And then the continued studying led me down the path of Judaism. So every time that I studied further and found more irreconcilable issues with the Bible, it changed my perspective. I'm not closed-minded, I'm very open-minded. It's the fact that I'm so open-minded that I'm willing to adapt my beliefs based off of the available evidence that has led me down the path to where I'm at right now. So that's just a little bit about myself, and what I've done with my approach to the Bible is I use a approach that is used inside of law enforcement. I investigate the claims. So that is a little bit, very quick summary about myself as we get ready to go in. And so what we're going to talk about today that's so blatantly obvious is, where did the disciples and Jesus go after the resurrection? And this is absolutely critical because inside of the Bible itself, Paul tells you in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 14, that if Christ did not rise from the dead, then your belief is in vain. So the resurrection is absolutely critical to Christian belief. So the question is does it hold any water? So from there, we're going to go on and we're going to take a look at a few passages. And I want you to notice something. The very first one is going to come from what is stated in Matthew. We're just going to go with Matthew first. Then Jesus said to them, this is after the resurrection when he sees the women after the tomb. So the angels greet the women at the tomb and they tell him, hey, he said, go and meet him in Galilee, right? And then Jesus meets them, right? And he says the same thing. And Jesus said to them, do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to the Galilee, and they will see me there. Now the 11 disciples went to the Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. Okay, this is clear. After the resurrection, they went to the Galilee. What's John say? This is sometime after the resurrection, with some events happening in Jerusalem. John's a weird book anyway compared to the rest of them, but this is what John has to say. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. If you look up where Tiberias is, it's another name for the Sea of Galilee. And he showed himself in this way. So John also says, went to the Galilee. And as you might remember, John also says that there was the miracle of fish there again, right? Which is John's just completely off compared to the other three books, the other three Gospels, right? Give me just a moment. I didn't have it in my notes and I got to pull it up real quick because we're going to go to Mark next. So it's going to take me just a moment because you're going to see that Mark parallels Matthew. It's going to essentially say the same thing that Matthew did. So Mark is another one that, if you take a look at the history of Mark, not all versions of it have the long ending. So we're just going to take a brief look and see what Mark has to say. It's in Mark chapter 16. Mark chapter 16, verse 6, right? And he said to them, this is talking about the young man in white. A lot of people say it's an angel. Young man in white, do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him, but go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. And it says, and they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. That's how Mark ends in the oldest manuscripts. But in the long version, so again, notice it said, tell them to go to Galilee, and there you will see him. And then in the long version, they do see him, because Mary goes on to tell him, and then he appears to two disciples. This is kind of similar to the Road of Emmaus story that we see later on in another gospel. But then you have the Great Commission given inside of Mark, and then after that, he ascends, right? I'm not going to read all that. That would be a lot of reading, right? But the Great Commission's similar, not word for word the same, similar to Matthew, and then he ascends. Notice it happens in the Galilee, okay? So Matthew, they go and meet him in the Galilee, and then the Great Commission is given. Mark, they go and meet him in the Galilee, then the Great Commission is given and ascends. Ascends from a mountain in the Galilee. In John, spend 8 days inside of Jerusalem or so, because it's 8 days later that he appears to Thomas, who doubted, right? And then they go and meet him in the Galilee. Completely different reason. They're not going because they hadn't seen him yet. They'd already seen him. Where inside of Matthew and in Mark, they had not seen him. But inside of John, they had allegedly already seen him. And then they go to the Galilee. They're there. They've gone back to their lives. There's 7 of them that are named inside of John, not the full 11. They might have all been there, but only 7 are named. They've gone back to their lives. They're fishing. Who knows how much time has passed? It doesn't say. But they meet him there. And then he has some words with, Peter and the disciple whom he loves. And that's kind of where John kind of ends. And then we've got Luke and Acts. Luke, if you take a look at the end of Luke, all of this happens on one day. The resurrection, the women go to the tomb, and then you have the road to Emmaus. It says that very day. This is the same day as the resurrection. I'm not reading all of this. This would be a lot to read. You can read it yourself. That very day, road to Emmaus, the 2 walking. Jesus talks with them. They don't recognize him until he explains to them everything that's found in the scriptures, allegedly. He blesses the bread and breaks it. Then they're like, oh, snap, that was Jesus. Let's go tell the others. And so they go, and then they run and tell the others. That very hour, it says. The very hour. And then what happens? Then, while they're telling the others, Jesus appears to his disciples. And he says, peace to you. Look, my hands, my feet, touch me. See, for a spirit does not have flesh and bones, as you see that I have. Have you anything to eat? They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it. He talks to them, and then, after he talks to them, it says, and he led them out as far as Bethany, which is by the Mount of Olives. It doesn't say that, but if you look up where Bethany is and where the Mount of Olives is, you'll see that the Mount of Olives is in Bethany. Bethany is the region. Mount of Olives is a mount inside of Bethany. And lifting up his hands, he blessed them, and while he blessed them, he parted from them and was carried up into heaven. And they worshipped him and returned to Jerusalem with great joy, and were continually in the temple blessing God. But there's one key point in here that is not in Matthew, Mark, or John. You are witness of these things, says Jesus in Luke 24:48, and behold, I am sending the promise of my Father upon you, but stay in the city, this is Jerusalem, because they're in Jerusalem, until you are clothed with power from on high. How do I know that they're in Jerusalem? Because after the road to Emmaus, they ran back to Jerusalem. The two ran to Jerusalem, and that's what they told the others. So Jesus meets them in Jerusalem, shows himself in Jerusalem to his disciples, goes out to Bethany, a short walk from Jerusalem. They say it's about a Sabbath day's walk, not very far. Goes up to the Mount of Olives according to Acts, blesses them, and ascends to heaven. All the same day inside of Luke, which is ironic because they said that Luke and Acts were written by the same person. But what does Acts say? Acts says, it's coming from chapter 1, in the first book, Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus did and taught from the beginning while staying with them. He ordered them not to leave Jerusalem. This confirms what Luke just said, but to wait there for the promise of the Father. This, he said, is what you have heard from me. For John baptized with water, but you will be baptized with the Holy Spirit not many days from now. We know that that happened at Pentecost after 50 days. But also in the book of Acts, Jesus is with them for a total of 40 days before he ascends into heaven, which contradicts what Luke just said with it being on the same day. And he ascends into heaven, and this all happens on the Mount of Olives when it finally occurs. So, in the book of Luke, Jesus ascends on the very day that he resurrects. It happens in Jerusalem, where he meets everybody, takes them out to Bethany, to the Mount of Olives, a short walk from Jerusalem, ascends that day. Acts, he tells them not to leave Jerusalem in both Luke and Acts until they receive power from on high, which happens at Pentecost. He's with them for 40 days in Acts, and after that he ascends, so only 10 more days to go. They never leave the city, and then, of course, Pentecost happens, and you have the claims there. In Matthew, the disciples don't see Jesus until after they get to the Galilee. And then from there, Great Commission given, doesn't say that he ascends, but Mark is very similar. Mark tells them again, tell the disciples to go and meet Jesus in Galilee. So they go to the Galilee, they meet Jesus there. Great Commission given, and he ascends from a mountain in the Galilee. Okay, so you could say that Matthew and Mark correspond there. Those two basically have the same story. John, completely different, but they do end up in the Galilee at the final part of Jesus' ministry after the resurrection. If you can't see all the problems there, I don't know what else to tell you, because Luke most certainly leaves no room for going to the Galilee because it happens all in one day. Acts doesn't leave any room for going to the Galilee either, because they didn't leave Jerusalem at all for the 40-day period that Jesus was around after his resurrection, and then he ascends, and they're there for 10 more days for Pentecost to happen. And then, likewise, Matthew and Mark don't mention anything about coming back to Jerusalem. They don't mention the disciples seeing Jesus in Jerusalem at all, period. And then John has some Jerusalem and then some Galilee. The reason that they went to the Galilee is not because they were told to, they just went back to their lives. So there's a whole lot of discrepancies there that to me show that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Acts cannot be relied on for anything that happened in regards to the alleged resurrection of Jesus. And if you can't prove to me that Jesus' resurrection actually happened, then, well, as Paul so eloquently put it, it's in vain. So, this is my challenge to Christians. Prove to me that it happened. Reconcile this if you can, and I will catch you on the next one.